Commander Marcus Webb had walked this corridor for years, his strides steady on the polished concrete of one of the most secure naval facilities in the country. He trusted the routine of it, the certainty of protocol layered behind reinforced glass and biometric locks. That certainty broke when he saw motion through the window of the maintenance bay. At first he thought it was a reflection. Then he stopped, leaning just slightly toward the glass, and realized someone was inside. The bay was a sterile, cavernous space, built for silence except for the occasional rattle of tools on steel. On the table under the overhead lights lay a Barrett M82, dismantled into a dozen precision parts. Each piece had been placed carefully, almost ceremonially, as though the weapon were being studied rather than serviced. Behind it sat a woman in plain clothes. Her dark slacks and white blouse looked out of place against racks of military hardware. Her auburn hair was tied back, practical rather than styled, and her movements were deliberate, focused, mechanical in their precision. She cleaned each piece as if the rifle's function depended on her hands alone. Webb felt the hair rise on his arms. In 15 years of military service, he had developed a quiet radar for wrongness. The sense that something was out of place pressed at him now. He scanned the door, its biometric scanner steady and dark, and felt his pulse quicken. No one without clearance should be here. Certainly not a civilian. And certainly not with the kind of weapon usually tracked with the same rigor as nuclear components. He stepped through the door, his boots striking the concrete with an echo that seemed far louder than usual. The sound did not distract her. She kept working, running a cloth over the massive bolt, her hands sure and steady. The disassembled rifle looked like a set of ritual objects, each laid in sequence, as if she were performing an old and exact ceremony. "Ma'am, you are not authorized to handle that equipment," Webb said. His voice carried the clipped weight of command, a tone that had silenced platoons under fire. She did not look up. She did not falter. Her cloth continued its slow, deliberate polish. "I know," she replied softly, her tone calm, almost casual. Webb felt tension rise in his chest. In all his years, he had never heard someone acknowledge a breach so plainly while continuing to commit it. He took another step inside, eyes narrowing. The reinforced glass door clicked closed behind him, the sound of the lock emphasizing his isolation with her. "Then you need to step away from that weapon immediately and explain how you gained access," he said. His jaw had tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I walked in," she said, still focused on the rifle, her words delivered with the easy calm of someone discussing weather. Her defiance was not loud or confrontational. It was something stranger, a quiet presence that pushed against his authority without raising its voice. Webb realized then that the silence in the room was not empty. It was filled with her precision, each movement of her hand breaking it in a way that felt deliberate. The authority of his rank, his clearance, his command of this space was somehow being diminished by the simple rhythm of her work. The disassembled rifle gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its barrel polished to a mirror, its chamber being cleaned with practiced care. Webb stared, every instinct telling him this was impossible, yet it was happening, in the heart of a place where breaches were never supposed to occur. In that moment, he understood the deeper truth, one that unsettled him more than the violation itself. Clearance was only paperwork. Competence, carried with quiet certainty, could bend even the most rigid walls of security. Commander Marcus Webb kept his eyes on her hands, those precise and steady hands that moved across the heavy rifle's internals as if they belonged to the weapon itself. He tried again to assert himself, the clipped edge of command in his voice. But the response was not hesitation. It was knowledge, casually revealed. Knowledge no civilian should carry. She spoke his name aloud, though he had never given it. She recited an access phrase that matched his private credentials. She mentioned the maintenance backlog on this very rifle, a concern he had raised only in secure channels. Each word pressed into him like the slow turn of a screw. His jaw tightened. Breath drawn through clenched teeth, he turned toward the terminal at the far end of the bay. The glow of the login screen painted the metal wall with pale light, humming faintly in the silence. He hesitated. Protocol screamed that to type in what she had given him was to step into something far beyond his clearance. Yet the stillness of the room, the polished rifle pieces laid out like ritual artifacts, and the unwavering calm in her voice told him that refusing would leave him blind. He entered his clearance code. The terminal accepted it. As expected, then he added the secondary sequence she had given him. Numbers and letters arranged in a pattern that should not have existed outside a closed Admiralty circle. The screen shifted at once. A file appeared, marked classified at a level Webb had never seen. He clicked once, twice, and the text unrolled like a revelation. Barrett M. Wadavindoy. Serial number confirmed. Deployment history redacted. Service record 73 confirmed eliminations. Maximum engagement range, 3,247 meters. Webb's stomach dropped. The number alone made his skin prickle. He had studied the limits of ballistic capability his entire career, run the mathematics of wind drift, bullet drop, and atmospheric pressure. Shots of that distance belonged in theory, not in confirmed record. Yet here it was, written in the terse language of official documentation. He stared, heart hammering. Behind him, the woman kept working with unbroken rhythm, cloth sliding over steel. A careful inspection of a firing pin, her movements calm against the tension building in his chest. She did not need to look at the screen to know what he was reading. He realized with a cold clarity that she had already memorized every line. "This is impossible," Webb muttered it, not even sure he meant to speak aloud. "Impossible until it is not," she answered softly. Eyes never leaving the barrel, she polished. Her defiance was not loud, but it broke through his authority more effectively than shouting ever could. Silence pressed down heavier than alarms. The walls of protocol around him, built over years of service and reinforced by chains of command, fractured under the weight of what he now knew. She carried knowledge meant for a circle of 6, perhaps fewer. She bore it lightly, as if secrecy were not burden but armor. Webb looked back at the screen, scrolling again, rereading the line about confirmed eliminations. The cursor blinked steadily, indifferent to his disbelief. He had commanded men in combat, briefed intelligence officers, signed classified orders. None of that prepared him for the reality that true power could sit quietly across a table, hands steady, face calm, erasing his sense of control without raising a voice. The rifle parts gleamed under the lights, each piece polished to perfection. They reflected her presence more than his. Authority here did not belong to rank, or clearance, or paperwork. It belonged to the one who knew, the one who had done, the one whose name would never appear on any manifest. Webb let out a breath, slow and uneven. As the truth settled, competence had rewritten the order of the room. The hierarchy he had trusted no longer mattered. What mattered was that she existed and that no one in power would ever admit it. Jennifer laid the cloth flat on the table, creased perfectly into thirds, its edges squared as if even the fabric obeyed her discipline. She placed the trigger group on it and began polishing, each stroke exact, her pressure consistent as though she were restoring something more than steel. Commander Marcus Webb stood a few paces back, hands at his sides. Unable to break the silence that had grown dense between them, the bay smelled faintly of oil and metal, familiar scents to him. Yet in her hands they seemed elevated, almost ceremonial. She worked without hesitation. The trigger assembly gleamed under her cloth, catching the overhead light until it mirrored a faint sheen. She held it steady, tested its movement with a fingertip, then set it aside. The motion was fluid, unhurried, ritualistic. He realized she was not following a manual or checklist. Every motion was drawn from memory, the kind that lived in muscle and bone. Next came the bolt carrier. She inspected it with the same intensity, running her eyes along the steel as though searching for hairline fractures invisible to him. Webb had seen master armorers work before. Men who had spent entire careers servicing weapons, but their movements were technical, impersonal. Hers were different. Each placement was deliberate, each adjustment precise, as if she were reassembling something alive. The mirrored scope glass caught a stripe of fluorescent light when she lifted it. She turned it once, and for a heartbeat, the beam flared against the wall. Webb felt as if she were showing him not just a tool, but a reflection of herself, a fragment of identity revealed through glass and steel. She adjusted the mount with her thumb, the faintest pressure, ensuring it locked true. Nothing rattled. Nothing shifted. Webb's eyes fell to her hands. The calluses across her palms were not the soft marks of training, but the hard ridges carved by years of use. He saw faint scars, small lines across knuckles and fingertips, the signature of countless field assemblies done under stress, often in darkness or cold. Her trigger finger bore a flatness he recognized. It was the sign of someone who had fired more rounds than most soldiers ever would. He felt a quiet awe settle in him, the kind that came not from spectacle, but from recognition. This rifle, scattered into components only moments ago, was being brought back together with the reverence of ritual. She fitted the stock into place, balanced it against her shoulder for a fraction of a second, then returned it to the table. The silence in the room deepened, not empty, but filled with unspoken history. He realized then that for her, the Barrett was not a weapon in the ordinary sense. It was a companion, an extension of her. Each polished part carried a fragment of her own life, the weight of missions unseen, the imprint of decisions that had reshaped history without acknowledgement. The act of reassembly was not maintenance. It was memory. Jennifer clicked the final pin into place, her hands steady. The rifle lay whole again, gleaming under the lights, but different from before. Webb understood the transformation was not mechanical. It was personal. The Barrett was no longer an object. It was her. The truth struck him with a clarity words could not carry. Mastery did not reside in manuals or clearances. It lived in those who made tools into extensions of themselves. Jennifer's identity was not in any roster or file. It was here, written in steel, glass, and silence. The terminal screen glowed faintly against the steel walls, casting a pale light across the bay. Marcus Webb kept his eyes on the scrolling lines of redacted files, each blacked-out name and blurred identifier a reminder that he was staring into levels of secrecy beyond his clearance. The silence pressed down harder than any alarm. He turned from the screen toward her. Jennifer stood calm, her hands resting on the Barrett's worn carrying case. The fabric was scuffed from years of travel, the corners frayed, the leather handle darkened by countless grips. It looked less like military property and more like something lived with, carried across continents, hidden in shadows. Her eyes met his. They were dark, almost black, steady in a way that unsettled him more than the knowledge she had revealed. "Who are you really?" he asked, his voice lower. Now, stripped of command, she tilted her head slightly, expression unchanged. "I am whoever needs to be behind the rifle when the impossible shot has to be taken." Webb clenched his jaw. That was not an answer, not one he could accept. "I want your real name," he pressed, leaning forward slightly, his voice carrying the strain of someone used to certainty. Jennifer did not flinch. The silence stretched until it felt heavy enough to bend the air between them. "Real names don't survive in the places I work," she said softly. Her hand slid across the top of the Barrett's case, fingertips pausing on a tear in the fabric. "They are erased the moment a mission begins. I am Jennifer Walsh today. Tomorrow, I will be someone else. That is all the truth you are cleared to have." The glow of the terminal reflected in her eyes. Webb glanced back at the logs, each line a blurred memory of operations he would never know. each record broken by the thick marks of classification. The absence of names was louder than any presence. He realized that the redactions were not hiding mistakes. They were concealing lives. Identities burned away to protect both the operator and the mission. "You cannot expect me to accept that," Webb said, though his voice carried less force now. Her gaze held him firmly, quiet but dominant. "It does not matter what you accept. What matters is that when a target must be removed from 3,000 meters away through crosswinds and shifting ground, someone is there to do it. Someone who will never appear on your rosters." The air in the maintenance bay felt charged, as though the fluorescent lights were too loud. Webb wanted to challenge her again, to reassert command. Yet he found himself caught between disbelief and reluctant respect. He had interrogated enemies, confronted traitors, even faced fire on foreign ground. None of them had unsettled him like this woman who dismantled his authority with silence. He looked once more at the Barrett's case, at its worn edges that spoke of long service in places no one admitted existed. The weapon, whole, again, sat within reach, gleaming under the lights. He knew now it was not property of the Navy in any real sense. It belonged to her. Or perhaps she belonged to it. The distinction blurred in ways that made him uneasy. Jennifer finally spoke again, her voice calm. "Final. Clearance is paper. Names are ink. Both can be erased. What endures is the shot that lands when it must." Webb said nothing. The truth had already settled. Identity here was not fixed, not written in personnel files or command charts. It was fluid, defined by necessity, sustained by secrecy, erased by design. He stood in silence, aware that he was no longer the authority in the room. Marcus Webb stared at the terminal screen as the figure glared back at him. 73 confirmed eliminations. Maximum engagement range listed at 3,247 meters. He shook his head slowly, disbelief heavy in his voice as he muttered that no one could make a shot like that. The ballistic variables alone made it impossible. Jennifer did not pause in her work. She reached into the worn logbook tucked at the side of her case and flipped it open with deliberate care. On the margins of its pages were hand-drawn diagrams, circles and lines annotated with tight numbers. She tapped one with the edge of her finger. Bullet drop at that distance is measured in dozens of feet. You adjust elevation by entire body lengths, not inches. Wind drift must be read in layers. What happens near the muzzle is not what happens 3 kilometers away. Webb's throat tightened. Even so, conditions shift. Temperature, pressure, humidity. Those alone would ruin consistency. She lifted the scope and twisted the dial until the sharp click echoed across the bay. Temperature alters muzzle velocity. Barometric pressure changes trajectory curvature. Humidity can affect drag coefficient by fractions. At 3,000 meters, fractions decide whether someone lives or dies. You solve each variable in sequence, and then you solve them all at once. He studied her face, calm and steady. As she spoke, there was no boast in her tone, only certainty. She adjusted the scope again, 3 clean clicks, and set it down beside the polished barrel. The sound reminded him of a clock counting down, and the target he asked, searching for a flaw. A man moving across uneven terrain cannot be plotted like a stationary mark. Jennifer returned her gaze to the logbook, tracing one of the diagrams with her pen. You do not plot the man. You plot the rhythm, step length, speed variation, slope gradient. You learn to calculate the pause between strides, the lean of the torso on an incline, the stagger when footing shifts. Movement becomes math if you have patience to measure it. The weight of her words pressed against him. Numbers were not abstractions in her world. They were survival, sharpened into a weapon. He looked again at the terminal. 73 confirmed eliminations. The file did not brag. It documented inevitability. You make it sound like routine, Webb said. His voice carried less challenge now, more uneasy awe. She met his eyes. Expression unchanging. It is routine. Perfection has to be, when the shot matters. There is no second chance. The silence stretched as Webb considered the scope lying between them. The cold glass reflecting the overhead light. He imagined her lying prone on some distant ridge, wind pressing across her cheek. Numbers racing silently through her head, while the rest of the world doubted it could be done. His disbelief was collapsing under the weight of her calm. He wanted to argue, to retreat to the safety of logic that said no human could calculate, so much so fast, yet the evidence was in front of him. The rifle, the worn logbook filled with margin notes, the statistics on the glowing screen, and above all, her quiet certainty. Jennifer closed the logbook and slid it back into its case. The impossible shot is only impossible until someone makes it. After that, it is just math repeated under pressure. Webb exhaled slowly. The dread of understanding settling into him. What others called impossible had become her routine. Marcus Webb leaned against the edge of the steel table, his eyes drawn not to the rifle now whole again, but to the woman who handled it with such steady detachment. The hum of the overhead lights filled the silence. He asked the question before he could second-guess himself. Do you ever think about the cost, not just the calculations, not just the mission, the cost of pulling the trigger? For the first time since their encounter began, Jennifer paused. The faintest smile touched her lips, soft and fleeting. And then it was gone. Her hands remained on the Barrett stock, fingers running lightly over the textured grip. The silence deepened, weighted with something she had spent years burying. Every time, she said at last. Her voice was quiet, not broken, but carrying a weight that Webb felt settle against him like a stone. You do not forget. You do not ignore. You learn to fold the questions into a place they cannot stop you. Webb saw the scars then. They were small, pale lines across her knuckles. Visible when the light struck at an angle, they looked like the marks of someone who had fought her equipment as much as her enemies. Field-stripping rifles in mud and sand, bleeding into her gloves before pushing forward. The scars were reminders not just of battles fought, but of repetition, of burdens carried in silence. He pressed again, though softer now. And does it ever weigh too much? Jennifer opened the side pocket of her kit and drew out a folded patch. Its edges worn. The stitching faded. She set it on the table between them. Webb leaned closer. It bore no insignia. No name. Only a faint symbol rubbed nearly smooth by time. She looked at it for a moment. Her expression unreadable. It weighs exactly as much as it has to, she said, sliding the patch back into her kit. You do not carry more than that, or it will break you. You carry what you must, and then you put it away before the next mission. The silence returned, heavier this time, as if both understood that her words were less explanation than confession. Webb saw the brief vulnerability in her eyes. A shadow of sorrow quickly pulled back behind the same calm discipline that defined her every motion. She sealed the moment as efficiently as she had assembled the rifle, leaving no trace exposed. He realized then that her survival did not come from arrogance or detachment. It came from compartmentalization, from the ability to acknowledge unbearable weight without letting it slow her hand. She questioned herself, but she never allowed those questions to bleed into the shot. The mission always overrode the doubt. Jennifer rested her hand once more on the Barrett, her expression calm again. The faint crack in her mask already repaired. Burden is not optional, she said quietly, but hesitation is, and I cannot afford that. Webb understood. Her scars, a hidden patch. Even the subtle smile that had flickered and died, all of them were fragments of cost paid silently. She carried them, but she never let them stop her. It was the only way she endured. The terminal cursor blinked steadily, waiting for input. Marcus Webb sat before the screen, fingers poised above the keys, and felt the weight of the decision pressing against him. Protocol demanded he log everything. A breach of this scale would normally trigger alarms, inquiries, hearings that stretched for months. Yet beside him, Jennifer stood calm, the Barrett sealed neatly in its worn case. Her posture neither apologetic nor defensive. She carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew what he would choose. He typed a command and watched the entries vanish line by line. The record of her presence, the access code she had given, the classified file he should not have opened, all erased into silence. The screen cleared until only the blank menu remained, as if none of it had ever existed. Webb stared for a moment longer, then leaned back, exhaling the breath he had been holding. Jennifer stepped forward and extended her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused, the hand of someone who lived in the field rather than behind desks. Webb took it, the simple gesture carrying more weight than a signed order. It was not a salute, not a recognition of rank. It was trust exchanged without words, a silent acknowledgement that this moment would never be spoken of again. Neither of them said much. The hum of the overhead lights filled the space, joined by the faint scrape of her boots as she adjusted the strap on the rifle case. Webb's silence was conflicted, yet beneath it lay respect. The professional awe of a man who had commanded warriors, yet never encountered someone who could bend the very idea of authority without raising their voice. The Barrett rested secure within its case, locked and sealed, appearing ordinary to any passing glance, yet Webb knew it was more than steel and optics. It was an artifact of hidden history, bound to a woman who would never appear in official files. He felt a strange reverence as he watched her lift it effortlessly, as though the weapon and its burden weighed nothing at all in her hands. When she turned toward the door, Webb spoke at last, his voice quiet. "No one will know." She looked back, her expression unreadable, and gave a single nod. Then she walked away, moving, with the efficient calm of someone accustomed to leaving without leaving traces. The reinforced door closed behind her, and the bay returned to stillness. Webb remained by the terminal, the blank screen glowing faintly. He knew he had just crossed a line no training manual accounted for. But some truths were not meant for paper. Some lives could only be protected by silence. The record would show nothing, yet the memory would endure, carried forward in the mind of one man who chose trust over protocol. 36 hours later, Marcus Webb sat alone in his office, the glow of the television screen casting shifting light across the walls. The news ticker scrolled along the bottom, bland in its language, reporting that a high-value target had been eliminated during a failed attack on American diplomatic personnel. Coalition forces were credited for the operation. No further details were offered. The anchor's tone was detached, a voice shaped for public consumption, speaking of events as though they were inevitable and faceless. Webb leaned back in his chair, hands folded loosely in his lap. He knew better. He remembered the silence of the maintenance bay, the way her hands had moved across steel with ritual precision, the quiet conviction in her voice when she said the shot had to be ready. He remembered the faint smile, subtle and fleeting, that had passed across her face before she disappeared through the door. It came back to him now, brighter than the headlines, sharper than the official record. He switched off the television. The room fell into silence, broken only by the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. He thought of the terminal screen, its records erased, the log entries wiped clean as if none of it had ever occurred. He had ensured that silence himself, his fingers deleting the only evidence of their encounter. The files were gone, but the memory remained, carried in the narrow space where protocol could not reach. In the armory below, the Barrett rested in secure storage, sealed inside its case like a relic waiting for the next mission. It would appear on inventory sheets as just another weapon, one among many, maintained and tracked without ceremony. Yet Webb understood that within its worn casing lived a history of shots that had bent the arc of conflict, the moments of precision that no official document would ever admit. He pictured her lifting it with ease, moving as if the rifle were not equipment but extension, as much a part of her as the calluses on her hands. Outside, the world moved on. Reports circulated. Politicians spoke in measured phrases, and soldiers rotated through assignments. No one asked how a moving target at 3,200 meters could be eliminated under shifting crosswinds. No one demanded to know who had been behind the trigger. It was easier that way. Clean stories kept the machinery of nations running. But in quiet corners, legends took shape. Webb knew how stories spread among operators. Whispered, when the official record failed to explain. A sniper who appeared without orders, who made shots that seemed impossible, who left before her name could be logged. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others swore it was truth. Webb said nothing. His silence was both shield and acknowledgement. He rose from his chair and looked out the narrow window at the base lights glowing against the night. The memory of her eyes came back, steady and unflinching, carrying weight no rank could measure. He realized that her existence was defined not by clearance or paperwork, but by necessity, by the lives saved in moments the world would never see. Some victories were not meant for parades. Some heroes were written out of history before the ink could dry, yet their impact endured. Undeniable, carried forward in whispers, and in the quiet respect of those who had witnessed enough to know. Webb carried it now, the ghost of an operation that would never be spoken aloud, and the memory of a woman whose every shot counted more than the records that tried to erase her.